Okay, brief reminder, remember, it's going to be kind of important, well, kind of important. So we talked about blood vessels, just as a kind of reminder. So 3 types of arteries, right? We got elastic that buffer the fluctuations in blood pressure. We got muscular that contributes to the regulation of the tissue perfusion, and then we've got arterioles, which are resistance vessels, and they mostly contribute to the regulation of blood pressure per se. Now, something that I wanted to mention that I forgot to mention last time, when we talked about veins, we discussed the function in details kind of, but we never mentioned another role of veins as capacitance vessels. Capacitance vessels means that most of the blood at a given moment in the circulatory system is in veins. Does that make sense? Is that clear? So they are capacitance vessels. Okay, so bioreceptor reflex, we discussed it before. So basically sympathetic stimulation increases the cardiac output, which increases blood pressure. It also leads to vasoconstriction, which additionally increases blood pressure. And parasympathetic stimulation does the opposite. We talked about cardioinhibitory and cardioacceleratory centers. Now we're going to talk about a couple of renal mechanisms that regulate blood pressure. Okay. So there are direct and indirect renal mechanisms. So to kind of provide us with, like the equation, remember we discussed that blood pressure, okay, it is proportional to the cardiac output multiplied by the peripheral resistance. Okay, and cardiac output in a way represents the blood flow. Here's the direct renal regulation of the blood pressure. So when blood pressure rises, how does that affect blood flow? So when blood pressure rises, the amount of blood that goes through the kidneys also increases. Does that make sense? Higher pressure, higher blood flow. With increased blood flow through the kidneys, remember kidneys are the filters of the blood. Urine output increases as well, right? Which means we produce more urine, which means we excrete more water. And since we excrete more water, how does it affect blood volume, anyone? Yes, our blood volume goes down, which means that our blood pressure also goes down. Makes sense, right? That's pretty straightforward. So if you want to write that same direct renal regulation for lower blood pressure, it's going to be the same. Just flip the arrows. That makes sense? Just basically write the same sequence, just flip the arrows. So this is direct renal regulation of blood pressure. Now what about indirect? Now I find this absolutely fascinating. So I want to highlight that this mechanism only is being engaged when blood pressure actually drops. Check this out. When blood pressure decreases, it results in the release of renin, the hormone in the kidneys. Does that make sense? Now, renin is a very interesting hormone. Renin chemically converts the enzyme, renin is the hormone and the enzyme, and it chemically converts angiotensinogen, the precursor, into the molecule tensin 1. Now, angiotensinogen is produced by the liver. It's another hormone. Okay. Remember, when we talked about endocrine system, we talked about hormones. One of the sort of fundamental thing here is that hormones are released into the blood, right? So all those molecules are, as a matter of fact, in the blood. Angiotensinogen is in the blood. Angiotensin 1 is in the blood. Angiotensin 1 ends up in the lungs, okay? Where angiotensin 1 is converted into angiotensin 2 by so-called angiotensin converting enzyme, which is present in the lung vasculature. Now, I don't know how closely you follow the science behind the current pandemic, but turns out that one of the forms of angiotensin converting enzyme, so-called ACE2, it's a membrane-bound form, serves as the receptor for the current pandemic coronavirus. Okay? The point is that angiotensin converting enzyme converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Remember, those molecules are all in the blood, so eventually angiotensin 2 ends up in the adrenal medulla and results in the release of aldosterone from adrenal medulla. And as you may remember from our previous conversations about endocrine system, release of aldosterone increases sodium retention, which increases water retention, which increases blood volume, which increases blood pressure. Does that part make sense?
So
Okay.
from the renin, then it goes down to the...
It doesn't go down. So renin is the enzyme that converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Okay? And the release of renin is stimulated by low blood pressure. Are you following?
Can you say that first part again?
So when blood pressure drops, it signals to renin to be released. Renin converts angiotensinogen produced by the liver into angiotensin 1. Okay? Angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2 by the ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme. That makes sense so far? It's just a chain of events. Angiotensin 2 stimulates aldosterone. Aldosterone, that's a typical pathway, increased sodium retention, increased water retention, increased blood volume, as a result, increased blood pressure. So far, so good. Just now, here's some sort of associative. So it kind of harkens back to our previous conversations about secondary endocrine organs. So here you have two already, kidneys and liver. Now, one interesting story. Have you heard about ACE inhibitors? So ACE inhibitors, well, inhibit ACE. ACE, like a card. Now, you may not know where they originally were derived from. A team of, and it's interesting how science works. So one of the symptoms of a bite by a viper, a venomous snake, is a dramatic drop in blood pressure. And scientists were curious, what causes it. And long story short, they managed to isolate a component of the viper venom that was essentially first ACE inhibitor. After some modifications, blah, 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 they managed to produce, the first pharmaceutically acceptable one. And actually the folks that did that, they got Lasker Award, which is kind of a big deal. At that time, it was not predictive of a Nobel. They didn't get Nobel Prize, but many people who get Lasker Award also get Nobel Prize eventually. But this is one of the questions that I ask students. Does that make sense? Okay. So one of the questions that I ask students, it's not really a joking question, but if you have a person next to you, like you were on a hike, and this person gets bitten by a viper, okay, and the result of it is precipitous drop in blood pressure, and you are relatively close to a town where there's Starbucks, what is the best way to make sure that this person doesn't die of shock before you bring them to the hospital? So what's going to happen to that person after the bite? What's going to happen to that person's blood pressure? It's going to go down. So what do you need to do? You need to temporarily somehow get it up. How can you do it? Caffeine, yes. It is a known fact that if you can give a person, like on the way to the hospital, give them strong coffee, so basically to increase the pumping capacity of the heart, that is not a bad idea. That makes sense? Because the immediate effect of caffeine is increased heart rate. Yes, we all know it's diuretic. So eventually we'll start peeing, which is not a great idea, really, like diuretics in this case. But we're talking about like 5-10 minutes before the person passes away. Does that make sense? Okay?